Welcome. So we're going to look at Chapter 20 today, and this is the building blocks for some of the basic foundations of the macroeconomy that we're going to look at. So we're going to look at the IS curve and the associated goods market equilibrium that comes out of this particular model. So the basic intuition behind the IS curve is the idea that it's going to represent there's going to be an equivalency between the amount of goods that people want to buy and the amount of output that's actually produced. So there's a balance between those two. And so that's the basic idea here, is that given the desired spending by households, by firms, by government, and we can also throw in the net export sector as well, how much income and production is necessary in order to balance those two out. Again, the idea is that, well, income is going to factor into consumption, and consumption is going to factor into production, and so there's sort of a circular equivalency or balance in that sense. So there's four basic components that are going to go into this, and we'll talk about these momentarily. The first is planned household consumption. So the idea is simply what factors determine how much households want to buy. The second piece of the economic puzzle here is the behavior of firms, and specifically we think about firms buying capital and equipment to produce goods and services. And so firms have some desired level of investment spending as well, and so we call that planned investment spending. Again, a small distinction here in terms of thinking about the macroeconomy and this notion of investment. It's not buying and selling stocks on Wall Street, but it's purchasing new capital and equipment, and we'll also see here it's going to be residential investment. So it's capital expenditures is what we're thinking about in terms of investment. The third piece is government expenditures. Again, this is the state, federal, and local level, how much governments are purchasing. And then the last piece is the net export sector, which we'll talk about. And so the point here is we need to figure out what determinants are going to enter into each of these four spending components. And at the end of the day, what's going to happen here is we're going to determine a goods market equilibrium, and that's going to be where the total amount of consumption plus planned investment by firms, plus government spending, plus net exports is exactly equal to how much goods are actually produced. So in other words, the desired level of spending just matches what's actually being produced by firms. So that's going to be our notion of a goods market equilibrium. So if we look at planned consumption, there's three basic factors that are going to impact or sort of explain consumption behavior. The first is what's referred to as autonomous consumption. And we can simply think of this as spending out of non-income sources. So this could be out of your wealth or savings or something like that. Okay, so if you win the lottery, you're going to go out and spend a boat, but that doesn't affect your income, right? So autonomous consumption is going to be independent of income spending. The second factor, of course, which is going to be an important one, is how much money you make, your income. And in particular, we're going to be concerned with disposable income. So as disposable income rises, you have more money in your pocket to be able to spend on goods and services. So people are going to run out and buy consumption goods based upon how much disposable income they have. A couple of quick assumptions here. We make the simplifying assumption that taxes are independent of income, so it's sort of like a flat tax. Again, that's just a simplifying assumption to make the analysis relatively simple. You can complicate it by assuming that taxes are a function of income, and it makes it slightly more complicated, but doesn't change fundamentally the results. The second piece is this notion that households are going to spend a fraction of any additional income, and that fraction is relatively constant. We refer to that as the marginal propensity to consume. As we get one more dollar of extra disposable income, how much of that do we spend on consumption goods? And so we also assume that taxes are going to be exogenous, right? So they're just determined by politicians in Washington, D.C., and that's sort of independent of all of the other modeling that goes on in this model. And then the third piece, which could sometimes be important, is thinking about interest sensitivity to consumption. So households might buy really expensive things like cars and automobiles and washers and dryers and refrigerators. Those things are expensive, and sometimes they're bought on credit. So consumption could be sensitive to changes in the interest rate. And again, the basic notion is as the interest rate rises, it becomes more costly to borrow to purchase these consumption goods. So the incentive to consume goes down and the incentive to save goes up. So if we put all these pieces together, we have this seemingly complicated equation here, but it's actually fairly straightforward. Again, we have this autonomous consumption piece, which is independent of wealth or income, independent of income rather. We have the second component there, which tells us how disposable income impacts consumption. And then the third piece, as I said here, we have this piece here, which tells us how sensitive consumption is to changes in the interest rate. Again, we have the minus sign there because as rates go up, that discourages consumption. And I think, oops, so that parameter C is simply the parameter which adjusts the, or tells us how sensitive interest rate changes translate to consumption. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The second, which is a bit more complicated as it turns out, is planned investment. And so planned investment, again, in some sense represent the amount of investment that firms would like to engage in a particular period of time. Okay, as it turns out, and we'll see here in a minute, that's not necessarily the actual amount of investment that's going to occur. Okay, but there's two basic categories of planned investment. The first is planned fixed investment. So there's two sub pieces to this puzzle here. The first is what's referred to as business fixed investment. So this is things like plant, machinery, equipment, software, all of the things that businesses do to be able to produce goods and services. They buy these things and to increase their capital for productive purposes. The second piece is new residential investment. So every time you build a house, that adds to the capital stock, and that is included in this business, in this fixed investment piece. And then the second basic category here that we can differentiate is the planned inventory investment. Again, firms may voluntarily decide that they want to build up their inventories, maybe in advance of the economy taking off. They want to be able to have extra goods on hand to be able to sell. Okay, and so firms may choose to voluntarily build up their inventories or draw them down, and that's going to factor into this planned inventory investment. So when we put these pieces together, the total amount of planned investment is just equal to the the fixed investment component plus the planned inventory investment component. And so it turns out, not surprisingly, that these things are going to be sensitive to the interest rate. And the intuition behind that, and I'll get to that in a second, is essentially that interest rate is the cost of borrowing, and that's going to reflect firms' desire to purchase capital. So we have these two determinants of these planned investment components. The first is what's referred to as autonomous investment. And so, again, this is the amount of investment that firms engage in that's independent of any other factors, including the interest rate. And so Keynes referred to this as, this is sort of referred to as the animal spirits thing, where investment by firms is going to be moving up and down for reasons which are sort of unexplained. But there's some intuition behind this. So, for instance, if the government changes the tax code, then that can change incentives for firms to purchase capital equipment, right? So that could impact that IBAR, the autonomous investment component. If prospects for the future of the economy change dramatically, then that could impact firms' decisions to want to engage in increasing the capital stock today in order to be able to produce more goods tomorrow to profit off of economic growth, for instance. So those are the things that could be moving autonomous investment around. And then the second piece, as I referred to before, investment is also going to be sensitive to the interest rate, in particular the real cost of borrowing. And again, the basic idea here is that if you have firms, they're expending money on really expensive pieces of capital equipment, plant, machinery, very high costs for these items. And so typically we think of them as borrowing money to be able to do this. So not surprisingly, if it costs more to borrow money, then firms are going to want to borrow less and therefore increase the capital stock by less. Okay, so you would expect an inverse relationship between the interest rate that firms have to pay, the real cost of borrowing that firms have to pay, versus the amount of capital investment that it engages in. This is also true in terms of inventory and housing for similar reasons. Now, we don't distinguish between whether or not firms literally have to borrow money to purchase capital equipment, or they have their own cash on hand, right? So in other words, if firms have to, if firms finance capital equipment internally, the real cost of borrowing is still going to be the opportunity cost of engaging in investment. And again, the intuition is that, well, firms could either use their own money to purchase the capital equipment, in which case they're foregoing interest that they could be loaning out to other people. Alternatively, they could borrow the money on the open market and pay that market interest rate. So either way, either implicitly or explicitly, they're going to be subject to this opportunity cost. And then we say that, and then we can measure the sensitivity of investment to the interest rate through this parameter D right here. So when we put these pieces together, our notion of planned investment, again, is just going to be our autonomous investment. And then we have this piece here, which represents the opportunity cost of engaging in these planned investment activities. So a couple things to keep in mind here. The real cost of borrowing can be impacted by financial conditions in the economy, and in particular can be impacted by the availability of credit. And so the idea here is that we can have a disconnect between sort of the benchmark safe interest rate that could be prevailing and the actual interest rates that firms face when they go to these borrowing markets. And so the idea then is that that's going to be reflected in credit spreads, okay? So in other words, you can have these underlying interest rates which prevail in the economy, but because of financial frictions, that can raise the interest rates that that firms face to be able to borrow to purchase capital equipment, for instance. And so we measure this through this so-called financial frictions aspect of it, okay? So financial frictions, that is, if there's the financial markets are gummed up, there's going to be less availability of credit, and that's going to raise the real cost of borrowing to firms. So we have an additional sort of nuance to this story here in terms of the interest rate that firms face to borrow to purchase capital equipment. It's going to be determined not only through this so-called safe or benchmark interest real rate, but it's also going to be determined by the level of financial frictions, which is going to be important as we talk later on about financial crises. So if we put all these pieces together, our planned level of investment then, again, is going to be determined by autonomous investment. And then it's also going to be determined by this opportunity cost of investment, which takes into account the benchmark interest rate that we can borrow from, plus this effect of credit spreads and financial frictions and how that can impact the accessibility of credit by firms. So one other note, it turns out that sometimes firms produce more goods than people actually buy, right? And so what they do with that is they end up putting those goods in inventory, and then later on they draw off those inventories, okay? Now this is going to be an important story later on when we look at a goods market equilibrium. But the basic idea is that if firms produce more goods than they really wanted to or desired to, then at the end of the day, they're going to have some amount of unplanned inventory investment, okay? So again, this is on top of the potentially planned inventory investment that firms decided to engage in. And so the simple intuition, again, is that if you look at what households, government, other firms, and the net export sector desire to spend, okay, if firms end up producing more than that level, there's going to be a difference between the two. That difference is the level of unplanned inventory investment, okay? And so we denote that level of unplanned inventory investment as the difference, again, between the actual level of investment and that planned level of investment, IP. And so it turns out, as I motivated you before, in a goods market equilibrium, firms are going to produce exactly enough to satisfy the desired planned investment by households, firms, government, and the net export sector. And so if we match those things, then as it turns out, the amount of unplanned inventories are going to be equal to 0. Planned investment is going to be exactly equal to actual investment in the economy. And what that means is that the amount of planned spending by households, firms, government, and the net export sector, as I said, is equal to actual production, and we get this goods market equilibrium occur. Okay. So a couple more sectors to take into account. The planned government spending. We assume that government spending is just determined by some exogenous political process. Budgets are typically set many years in advance, or many months rather, and so these things are all sort of fixed and set in stone in advance. And so we assume simply that government spending is exogenous, and so G is set to this G bar level. Now, what about net exports? Again, we can typically think of net exports being affected by the exchange rate. And what we're going to do here is we're going to proxy for the exchange rate by considering the effects of interest rates on the exchange rate. So to lead you through a thought experiment, suppose that the domestic currency depreciates. It turns out that when you have a currency depreciation, the amount of imports go down, the amount of exports go up, okay? And again, the intuition of that is that with a currency depreciation, each unit of domestic currency buys less foreign currency, okay? And so if each unit of domestic currency buys less foreign currency, then you're going to be importing less, okay? The flip side of that is each unit of foreign currency can now buy more domestic currency so that people in other countries can buy more of your goods, so exports are going to rise. And so what that means then is that the total impact of this is that net exports are going to go up when you have a currency depreciation. Now we can do the opposite of that. When you have a domestic currency appreciate, then you have the opposite. Imports go up, exports go down, net exports then decrease. And so what we're going to do here is make a proxy, a bridge between our notion of exchange rates and interest rates and how that affects this net export story as a simplification. So very simply, what will happen, and we'll learn more about this in chapters 17 and 18 when we look at foreign exchange markets, is that when the real interest rates go up, we should expect the domestic currency to appreciate. And as we just saw, that means that net exports are going to fall, and vice versa. So at the end of the day, you would expect an inverse relationship between the real interest rate and our level of net exports. So what does all that mean? Well, we also have this other point, this other piece here, this autonomous net exports piece. So this is just going to be all the other things that could affect net exports that are independent of interest rate effects or exchange rate effects. And when we put those things together, we again have this planned net export function here, which is composed of those two factors, the autonomous net exports, as well as this interest rate effect, which is really proxying for exchange rate effects. So the parameter x, again, just represents the sensitivity of changes in exchange rates and hence real interest rates on net exports. Whew, that was a mouthful. So what does that leave us? Well, again, the whole point of this is to think about what we refer to as a goods market equilibrium. Again, the notion is that the total production is exactly equal to what households, firms, government, and accounting for the net export sector would desire or plan or like to buy, okay? And so, as I said before, a goods market equilibrium is going to occur where unplanned inventory investment is 0, total investment is equal to planned investment, and of course, the total amount of goods produced, the actual level of production here, is exactly equal to what is being planned by households, that piece right there, okay? And so if we put those two pieces together, again, setting a goods market equilibrium simply says, let's assume the total amount of production is exactly equal to what households, firms, and government and net export sector want to buy, planned income or planned total production. So we set y equal to c plus planned investment plus g plus net x. And if we do this, again, we have these slightly more complicated expressions for there's consumption, There's our planned investment. And of course, we have government spending there and our net exports there. Okay. And what do we do when we get those things together? Well, if we cram all those things together and solve for y as a function of everything else, then we get this somewhat complicated looking expression here. It turns out when you put numbers into it, it collapses down to a line, a linear equation. Okay. So what does this linear equation mean? Well, first of all, in the picture here, you can see that we've graphed this so-called IS curve. And so that's this line that runs through points A and B. The intuition behind this is simply this idea that we're forcing a goods market equilibrium. So that's any point along that line represents a point at which the level of income satisfies the desired spending by household, firms, government, and net export sector. So in other words, any point on that line, total production is exactly what households, firms, government, and the net export sector combined would like to purchase. Okay. And so it's downward sloping in the sense that, well, when the real interest rate falls, that means it becomes cheaper to consume, it becomes cheaper for firms to borrow, and the net export sector gets more exports relative to imports. And so planned spending rises, and therefore firms are triggered to raise production in order to meet those higher planned spending levels. Okay. So that's the intuition behind this IS curve. And so points, as I said, points A and B both represent a goods market equilibrium. Okay. But what if we aren't at this goods market equilibrium? This is where this inventory story comes into play. So suppose that we are at a point like point G. So at point G, we know that the total amount of output produced, if we're holding interest rates constant, say at this interest rate of 3%, we know that at that point, point G, we're producing more than households, firms, and government and the net export sector would like to produce, would like to purchase at that level of income. And so what's going to happen is that firms, if they continue to produce at that level, they're going to continue to build up their inventory stocks. And so firms recognize this, and that triggers them to cut back on production. And so as firms cut back on production, we move here to point A. A similar story can be told here for point H. At point H, there's excess demand in the sense that firms aren't producing enough at that level of income and holding that interest rate constant to satisfy households, firms, government, and the net export sector. And so what's going to happen there at point H is that there's firms are going to draw down existing inventories. And in fact, if you calculate at point H, there's an unplanned inventory investment of minus $1 trillion. So that represents firms drawing down existing inventories. Now, what that means for getting us to this goods market equilibrium is that if firms don't adjust production, they're going to run out of inventory. They're going to run out of goods to sell. So the drawdown in inventories and the unplanned inventory reduction is going to trigger firms to increase production. And as that occurs, as firms increase production, eventually we'll move towards a point like point B. Okay. So the last point that I want to point out is that this IS curve, it looks a lot like an aggregate demand curve. Okay. It's similar and it's related, and as we'll see, it's very closely related, but it's different. With the IS curve here, we're measuring the real interest rate versus the aggregate amount of output demanded at that real interest rate. Implicitly, we're holding the inflation rate constant. When we look at aggregate demand, what we'll see is that aggregate demand is going to be a relationship between inflation and the aggregate amount of output demanded at that level of inflation. So again, we'll see that they're closely related, but they're definitely distinct nonetheless. Thank you.